What does it mean when God seems silent in the middle of your panic? If you've ever felt abandoned by God in your darkest moments, this story is for you. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Jesus' sleep might be the most comforting thing about this entire miracle. Hit that like button and let's dive in. To understand why Jesus' sleep was so shocking, you need to understand the Sea of Galilee. This isn't just any body of water. It's a geographical trap for deadly storms.
The lake sits 700 feet below sea level, surrounded by hills and valleys that create wind tunnels. When weather systems move through the region, they get funneled down these valleys and explode across the water with terrifying speed. Calm waters can become life-threatening in minutes. These weren't tourist fishermen. Peter, Andrew, James, and John had grown up on this lake. They knew every current, every wind pattern, every warning sign. If they were panicking, this wasn't just a rough patch of weather. This was genuinely dangerous. Mark tells us it was evening when Jesus said, "Let's go to the other side." They'd been teaching crowds all day. Jesus had been pouring himself out through parable after parable, and now he wanted to cross to the less populated eastern shore. But here's the first crucial detail most people miss. It was Jesus' idea to cross the lake. He initiated this journey. He led them directly into the path of this storm.
This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad timing. This wasn't God being caught off guard by weather patterns. As they set out, other boats joined them. It was probably a peaceful evening departure, maybe even beautiful. The sun setting over the water, a gentle breeze filling their sails. Jesus, exhausted from the day's ministry, finds a cushion in the stern of the boat and lies down. And then the wind begins to change. What starts as a gentle breeze becomes a strong wind. The strong wind becomes a gale. The gale becomes what Mark calls a great windstorm, the kind that turns seasoned fishermen into terrified children.
Waves aren't just splashing over the sides now. They're crashing over the boat, filling it with water. The disciples are bailing frantically, fighting the storm with everything they have. And through it all, Jesus sleeps.
Finally, when they can't take it anymore, the disciples wake him up. But listen carefully to how they do it. They don't gently shake his shoulder and whisper, "Master, we could use some help."
No. Mark records their exact words. "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing?"
That's not a request for help, that's an accusation. Don't you care? In other words, how can you sleep while we're dying? What kind of leader abandons his followers in their moment of greatest need? If you really loved us, you'd be awake, alert, helping us fight this storm. They're not just afraid of the storm anymore. They're afraid that Jesus doesn't care about their survival.
Think about how this must have felt. These men had left everything to follow him. They'd watched him heal the sick, feed the hungry, cast out demons. They'd heard him teach with authority that amazed crowds. They'd begun to believe he might actually be the Messiah. And now, when they need him most, he's asleep? Their question reveals something deeper than fear of drowning. It reveals their fundamental uncertainty about Jesus' character. In their minds, love means constant vigilance. Care means never resting when your people are in danger. A good shepherd stays awake all night to protect the sheep. But Jesus had been sleeping peacefully while they fought for their lives. This wasn't just about the storm on the water. This was about the storm in their hearts. The doubt that crashes over us when God seems absent in our darkest moments. How many times have you felt this way? How many times have you wanted to shake heaven awake and shout, "Don't you care that I'm drowning? Don't you see what I'm going through? Why aren't you doing something?"
Their accusation is brutally honest, and it's one that echoes through every generation of believers who've ever felt abandoned by a silent God. Jesus wakes up, not startled, not frantic, not apologetic for sleeping through their crisis. He stands up in the rocking boat, looks out at the chaos, and speaks 2 words to the wind and waves. "Peace, be still." And everything stops. Not gradually, not slowly, instantly. The wind doesn't die down. It ceases completely. The waves don't calm. They become perfectly flat. The storm doesn't weaken. It disappears. Mark uses a phrase that's almost comical in its understatement. There was a great calm. One moment, life-threatening storm. Next moment, glass-like serenity.
But then Jesus does something that's almost more shocking than the miracle itself. He turns to his disciples, these men who've just witnessed him command nature itself, and asks,
"Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?"
"Wait, what?"
They're probably still catching their breath, still bailing water from the boat, still processing what just happened. And Jesus is questioning their faith?
That stings. They'd just survived what they thought was certain death. They'd just witnessed the most incredible display of divine power they'd ever seen, and instead of comfort or congratulation, they get a gentle rebuke. But Jesus wasn't being harsh. He was being educational.
See, his question reveals the real issue. The storm wasn't the problem. Their response to the storm was. Their fear wasn't about wind and waves. It was about trust and presence.
Jesus was teaching them something profound. He doesn't sleep because he doesn't care. He sleeps because he's not afraid.
Why was Jesus asleep? I believe there were 3 reasons, and each one reveals something crucial about how God operates in our lives. First, his humanity was real.
Let's not spiritualize this away. Jesus was exhausted. He'd been teaching crowds all day, pouring himself out through story after story, dealing with people, pressing in from every side. When Mark says he was asleep on a cushion, he's showing us that Jesus' human body needed rest just like ours do. This is actually comforting. It means when you're tired, when you're drained, when you feel like you can't take one more step, Jesus understands that completely. He's been there. He's felt the weight of physical and emotional exhaustion. But that's not the whole story.
Second, his peace was bigger than their panic. Jesus wasn't sleeping because he was indifferent to their danger. He was sleeping because he wasn't afraid of it. Think about this. What does it take for someone to sleep peacefully in the middle of a life-threatening storm?
Complete trust. Jesus trusted the Father so completely that even potential death didn't disturb his rest. He knew that nothing could happen to him outside of God's will. He knew that his mission was secure, his disciples were protected, and his Father's plan would not be derailed by weather.
This wasn't detachment. This was divine security. He slept not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to trust completely. Third, the storm was the lesson. Here's the most challenging truth. Jesus could have prevented this storm entirely. He could have chosen a different route, a different time, a different day. But he didn't. Why? Because sometimes God leads us into storms not to harm us, but to reveal what's already inside us.
The disciples thought their problem was the wind and waves, but Jesus knew their real problem was deeper. It was their belief that if God is silent, he must not care. It was their assumption that divine love means constant intervention. It was their inability to rest in his presence when circumstances felt threatening.
The storm didn't create their fear, it exposed it. And once it was exposed, it could be addressed.
After Jesus calms the storm, Mark records the disciples' response. They were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?"
Wait. They were filled with great fear? They were more afraid after the miracle than during the storm?
That's because they suddenly realized who was sleeping in their boat.
During the storm, they were afraid they might die. After the miracle, they were afraid they might be in the presence of the Creator of the universe.
The wind and sea obeying Jesus wasn't just impressive. It was terrifying. Because in Jewish understanding, only God commanded the forces of nature. Only Yahweh spoke to storms and they listened. The Psalm says, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them." They'd sung those words in synagogue. Now they'd watch them happen in real time. Suddenly, Jesus' sleep made perfect sense. Of course, he wasn't afraid of the storm. He was the one who invented storms. Of course, he could rest peacefully. All of creation was under his command.
But this realization created a new problem. If Jesus was truly divine, what did that make them? What did it mean that God himself had chosen to travel in their boat? To entrust his safety to their seamanship? To sleep peacefully while they panicked? Their question, "Who then is this?" is the question every person must eventually answer. Because once you realize that Jesus isn't just a good teacher or a wise rabbi or even a miracle worker, but actually God in human flesh, everything changes.
Your storms are his storms. Your boat is his boat. Your panic is happening in the presence of the one who commands wind and waves with a word. What does this story teach us when we're in our own storms and God seems to be sleeping?
First, his silence doesn't mean his absence. Jesus was in the boat the entire time. The disciples felt abandoned, but they were never actually alone. God's presence isn't proven by his intervention, it's proven by his promises. When your prayers feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling, when heaven seems closed, when you're crying out and hearing nothing back, remember that Jesus is in your boat. The storm doesn't change that fact.
Second, his peace is available even in chaos.
Jesus didn't just calm the storm, he was calm during the storm. That same peace is available to you, not after your circumstances change, but right in the middle of them.
Paul wrote, "The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Notice he didn't say the peace that comes after understanding, but the peace that surpasses understanding. You don't have to understand why God allows your storm to experience his peace in the middle of it. Third, sometimes the storm is the classroom. What if God isn't sleeping through your crisis because he doesn't care, but because he's teaching you to trust his character more than your circumstances? What if the very thing that feels like abandonment is actually an invitation to discover that he's closer than you ever imagined? The disciples learned more about Jesus in that storm than they had in weeks of calm weather ministry. Sometimes it takes chaos to reveal divine peace. Sometimes it takes feeling abandoned to discover that you were never actually alone. Why was Jesus asleep while everyone thought they were dying? Because he knew something they didn't. The boat wouldn't sink if he was in it.
Not because storms can't be dangerous, not because fear isn't real, not because following Jesus means life gets easy,
but because the same voice that spoke worlds into existence was resting peacefully in their vessel. The same power that holds galaxies in place was present in their panic. Jesus doesn't always calm your storm immediately. Sometimes he sleeps through it, not to abandon you, but to teach you that his presence is more powerful than any chaos you'll ever face.
The disciples wanted Jesus to be awake and anxious with them, but he gave them something better. The demonstration that divine love sometimes looks like divine rest, that perfect trust sometimes appears as perfect calm.
He wasn't sleeping because he didn't care about their survival. He was sleeping because he cared so much about their growth. And when they finally woke him up, he didn't just calm their circumstances, he revealed his identity. Who then is this? The answer changes everything.
What storm are you facing right now where God seems to be sleeping? What situation has you convinced that if he really cared, he'd be more obviously active? Maybe the question isn't why God seems silent. Maybe the question is, who is this Jesus that even your worst storms have to obey when he finally speaks?
Share in the comments. What would change in your current situation if you really believe that Jesus is in your boat, even when he seems to be sleeping? I want to pray for the specific storms you're weathering. If this video helped you see God's silence in a new light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that reveal who Jesus really is. And remember, the boat won't sink if he's in it, even when the storm is raging, even when you can't see him working, even when it feels like he's asleep. The same voice that calmed the Sea of Galilee is present in your chaos right now. Trust his presence more than your panic.
Till next time, rest in the peace that surpasses understanding.
Amen.